Litvish, which is the Lithuanian style of Judaism, which is like the polar opposite of Hasidic Judaism. Hasidic Judaism is heavily influenced by Kabbalah, mysticism, and Lithuanian style Judaism is much more rational. So you'll find people who leave Hasidic Judaism, they seem often very lost, because they did not grow up, even if they grew up in America, they did not grow up in America learning how to speak English very well. Their primary language is Yiddish. They got very little secular education. So if they leave Hasidic Judaism, they're lost in the world, and it's highly unlikely that they will make anything of themselves in the wider world, because they were just not prepared for it. Someone who's brought up in the Lithuanian style of Judaism will have received a very solid secular education, and they will very frequently, they leave Haredi style Judaism, they will very frequently either move to modern Orthodox Judaism or to conservative or Reform Judaism, or just be secular, but they'll go on to get university educations, they'll go on to great accomplishments in the wider world. So Hasidic Judaism is generally the most closed off from the outside world. And this comes with some benefits in that you hear a lot about the ecstasy of Hasidic Judaism in the novels of Chaim Potok. It's much easier to achieve ecstasy and very tight community if you're operating primarily with just the other. So I'll give you an example. When I go to shop at Ralph's, I have to constantly check whether there's a kosher symbol on the foods that I'm buying. But if I go to shop at Glattmart, a kosher supermarket, I don't have to worry about that because I know everything there is kosher. So it's a lot easier for me to just interact, grab what I want. I don't have to think. So if you're living your life just with other observant Jews, you can go to their home, you're one part of one very tight community. It's easier to have that ecstatic communal experience because you don't have to worry about dealing with someone who is not observing the laws or someone who is not bound to your tradition.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And that's really what makes, I think, Potok such an interesting writer, such an interesting American fiction writer, Jewish American fiction writer, is because nobody until maybe the past 7 or 8 years was writing about the ultra-Orthodox or the Hasidic communities in America. Nobody was using fiction to approach that world. So he was really the only one doing it, which I think makes his work really interesting and really very progressive for its time.
See, I'm kind of moving on some of the other questions now. 95% of Jewish parents would not have a problem, Jewish parents in America and in the world would not have a problem if their kid wanted to take up painting.
Right.
They would let's get you, teachers, and let's get you to a special school where you can develop these skills and, be all you can be would be the attitude of 95% of Jewish parents.
Yeah.
Now, imagine that was the case with Asher Lev's parents. You'd have a very boring novel. Like if his community and his parents and it would just say, yeah, go for it, Asher Lev. It would be boring. So it's precisely these closed off communities that create this exciting literature and provide a setting that is at odds with modernity. What would you say, question number 2, are the chief characteristics of Hasidism that distinguish it from regular Judaism? Kabbalah is normative to Hasidic Judaism. It's not normative to other forms of Judaism. Hasidic Judaism is the most closed off from the outside world. Hasidic Jews are the least likely Jews to receive secular educations. For many of my years in Orthodox Judaism, I belonged to modern Orthodox synagogues where everyone is either like a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, a businessman, or a screenwriter. When I go to a Hasidic synagogue, very, very few of the people there will be doctors, lawyers, or accountants. Instead, they'll own their own plumbing business, they'll sell cars, they'll do some sort of manual work. These are Jews with muscles. They're an entirely different type of Jew, so they're the least likely to have secular education. Hasidic Judaism has been regarded by the rest of Judaism as an apostasy or heresy or definitely outside the norm. So Hasidic Jews have a Rebbe who's kind of an intermediary between them and God. So that is completely contrary to normative Judaism, which believes that everybody can approach God without an intermediary. Hasidic Jews often regard their rabbis as having wonder-working powers. This is not the way 98% of Jews regard their rabbis. Do you have any thoughts?
It's interesting. Would you really say that most Jews view it as an apostasy? Would you really say that?
I would say no, because most Jews don't think in these terms. Like most Jews don't think about apostasy.
Right.
But let's say Jews who are like rooted in Judaism and know the text of Judaism, when Hasidic Judaism came, it's regarded as outside the norm by the rest of Judaism, like the scholars of it. Now, it may be like a very interesting outside the norm, or if you're not Orthodox, there really are no norms, so you're not going to declare anyone outside the norm. It's just like another interesting, there are Reconstructionists, there's Reconstructionist Judaism, which reconstructs Judaism without God, so how would someone who accepts Reconstructionist Judaism then say that Hasidic Judaism is heresy? But that was certainly the way it was regarded by the Orthodox Jews of the time, and even since then, it's definitely regarded as, outside of what makes sense.
That's a good one. I mean, which is what we see, if you read Chaim Potak's The Chosen, that's exactly what you see. You see the difference between the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities. You see them at odds, literally and figuratively.
One student, in observing the copywriter My Name is Ashalev, 1972, and the fact that the novel is set even a bit earlier, it's set in the 1930s and 40s, wonders if the view of art within the Jewish community has changed at all in the past few decades. Do you think there has been even the slightest move towards finding value in art, or would you say the Jewish community's view of it as presented in Chaim Potak's novel is representative of the current view? Okay, once again, 95% of Jewish parents would have no problem whatsoever if their child wanted to devote his life to painting. So we're talking about the insular world of Hasidic Judaism, which probably accounts for somewhere between 2 to 5% of all Jews in America. So in that world, there's been no change in its relationship to art. And art does not have a high value in the traditional Jewish community, even outside of Hasidic Judaism and just regular Orthodox Judaism. It's not had a high value since the time of the temple. So the Torah places a value on art in the construction of the temple. It's supposed to be done according to very specific instructions, and there's certainly an artistic element to it. But since the destruction of the temple in year 70 of the Common Era by the Romans, art has had very little significance in traditional Judaism, and that has not changed. In watching members of question number 4, in watching members of a religious community, one often gets a skewed vision of that religion as far as its precepts and the fundamental spirit of those guidelines. How accurate in general do Potak's characters present the spirit behind the Jewish tradition? In other words, do you see Potak enabling readers that are familiar with Judaism or Hasidism to evaluate characters based on their alignments with or departures from the religion in its ideal form? Potak is very accurate in his representation of Orthodox Judaism, ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and Hasidic Judaism.
What's more complicated, I think, though, is for especially a non-Jewish audience to see those distinctions when he's talking about whether it's Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox or secular Judaism. I think sometimes it's difficult for non-Jewish readers, audiences, to understand those nuances and those complexities. But yeah, I would agree. I would agree that they're pretty spot on.
When did you start reading Chaim Potak novels?
I didn't read Chaim Potak until I was in grad school, believe it or not. Yeah.
Well, I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist, so because we keep the Sabbath, and because there's a strong body of law in traditional Seventh-day Adventism, we started. My whole family just devoured all of Chaim Potak's novels when I was 14 and 15. So I read all of them, and there's nothing as as profound and well written and engaging in Seventh-day Adventist literature to compare to the work of Chaim Potok with regard to the Sabbath. And I love them. My family